All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let's begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Abba Aleinu L'Tova. Alison Adam Steinmetz, in memory of Adam's grandfather, Rabbi Sheldon Steinmetz, out of Shlomo Tzvi, Ruvain ben Shimon Zichron Libracha, Sammy Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in memory of their dear friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yonah Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo, who fell in battle in Gaza on Erev Chanukah in 2023. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Drashos this month in memory of Paul's family, Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Bas Shulamis, and Esther Bas Zecharia. Our week of learning sponsors, Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin, in honor of the wedding of their daughter Sophie to Zevi Granat, Mazel Tov Mezeh Bizocha, to build the binyan Ad De Ad. And our Daf Yomi sponsors, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, for dedicating the shir and the schus of a continued refuah for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Sav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah, Shav, and together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, all the Chasanim and Kalos, Merit Hashem Shavizocha, to build the Bayis Naaman, all who have given their lives for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, Shavalichta Gan Eden, and Shabi Malitze Yosher for Am Yisrael, and Halavai, we should just be Zoche Meretz Hashem, the Besoros Tovos for our people, for our land, for many years to come. And let's say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, a really great daf and a half, right, for our purposes today. So today's daf is Ayin Hey 75. We are picking up on Ayin Dalet Amud Beis 74b. I believe we left off by Amr Belazar, Chavish Shal Truma. Is that correct? Where is that? Oh, 4 lines before? No, we did that. Amar Rabba. No, we did that. We did that. No, we didn't. Amar Rabba. Good, you're right. All right. Sorry. Okay, good point. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines down from the top. Good. Amar Rabba. So both remember again, Rabba said as follows, Reish Lakish, who was the case that we just had at the beginning of Ayin Dalet Amud Beis, the case in the beginning of 74b, where that was the case of the barrels of Truma, which were mixed together, and then one of the barrels fell in. Reish Lakish says you could assume, ultimately, that's what? That it was a barrel of Truma that fell in, and therefore the rest of the mixture is going to be permitted. So Rabbah says Reish Lakish only permitted a barrel. Why? Because by a barrel, ultimately, again, it is recognizable when there is a barrel that is lost. Aval te'ina lo, but in the case of the figs, which was the case of Rav Nachman, right, he would not permit it. But Yosef Rayat, because again, it's not recognizable. This goes back to the end of yesterday's daf, our end of yesterday's daf, where remember, again, the idea is we're concerned that if something is not recognizable, people may think that Avodah Zarah is batal. That's what our concern is. Rabbi Yosef says no. Afilu te'ina kinifilasa kach al yos. Rabbi Yosef says no. The same concept that applies by the barrel also applies by the fig. Namely, the same way that it fell in, ultimately, or the same way it prohibited is the same way that it permitted. So therefore, again, Rabbi Yosef just makes no distinction whether the item in question is a barrel or whether the item in question is a fig. Okay, incredible. Amr Belazar, next case. Chavish shel truma shenafla b'kup chavios. So interesting case here. Belazar says you have a barrel of truma that got mixed in with 100 other barrels. Belazar says obviously again. So remember, the idea over here is we're talking about sealed barrels. In general, sealed barrels are considered to be something that is chashuv, that is important, and therefore are not batal, or is not. A sealed barrel is not batal. So Rabbi Elazar advances what appears to be a very interesting piece of advice. Poseach echad mehen, open up one of the barrels. V'notal himene kedei dimu avashosa. Take out one of the barrels, remove the corresponding amount of truma, and throw it out. In other words, discard it, right? Go, in other words, not discard it. Take care of it, give it to a Kohen, do whatever you have to do, and that allows the rest of the mixture to go ahead and be permitted. So Yosef Ravdini heard this, v'ka'amar lahashmaita. So Ravdini was sitting before, and he said over this ruling, Amar le Rav Nachman said, Gama v'shasi kachazina hacha. Literally translated, the person who gave this ruling must have been partaking of the wine already, right? Which is another way of saying that doesn't make any sense. Because they will say, it appears that what is Rabbi Elazar saying? Rabbi Elazar is actually saying that halacha l'maisa, you could actively open up a barrel, take out the corresponding amount of truma. That doesn't make any sense. And others will say, there seems to be that you're actively being mevatel iser, which doesn't work. Ela ema, rather the way to say it is like this. Rather, the way to say it is like this. Rashi says, "Gama v'shasi kachazina hacha de'im came the posech lachatchila hakaimalon chavis tumos delobat lehechem ishkachasla." We'll say, really, what the Gemara is saying is like this. Rav Dini is saying is like this. If this is true, then you could remedy every case of mixed barrels this way. Just go ahead and open up a barrel. In other words, how do you ever have a case of a closed barrel that's not bottle? If you could easily remedy the circumstance by just opening up the barrels again. In other words, the approach doesn't make any sense. Rather, the way to say it is like this. If you have a barrel of truma that got mixed in with other barrels, and then what happened? One of the barrels opened. I didn't open it. It just opened up by itself. Then, okay, once it's already opened, then halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and remove the corresponding amount of truma from that open barrel and permit the rest of the mixture. Incredible. Rabbi says as follows: interesting case here. So Rabbi says you have a barrel of truma that got mixed in with 150 other barrels. Now remember, normally truma is batal in 100-to-1 ratio. Now, halacha l'maisa again, it was mixed in with 150 barrels, v'niftechu mea mehen, and ultimately 100 barrels ended up getting opened. Again, I'm not opening it, they ended up getting opened. What's the halacha? Notel heimene kedei dimua, remove the corresponding amount of truma from the already opened barrels, v'shosa, and ultimately, again, you could drink the wine. Ushar asurin ad sheyiftechu. But the rest of the barrels will be asur, ultimately, again, until they also are opened. Why? Because we can't permit the remaining barrels by simply saying that the truma was contained in the majority of barrels. Okay, incredible. So let's go back there. Harova v'hanirva. So now back to the Mishnah. So remember again, the Mishnah was dealing with different cases of a prohibited animal that gets mixed in with other sacrificial animals. So one of the cases of the Mishnah is if you have an animal that was used for immoral purposes that gets mixed in with the rest of the group. So the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, you allow the group to graze until it develops a mum. Then you go ahead and you sell off the animals, and you use the value of the most expensive animal to purchase your replacement carbon. It says the Gemara, Bishtama kulhu lo yediya. So included in this group is a treifa animal that gets mixed in. So the Gemara says, Bishlama kula lo yediya, ela hai treifa hechi dami. What's the case of treifa? The Gemara says, in all these other cases, let's say an animal that was used for immoral purposes. I know the animal got mixed in, but obviously that animal is not discernible. Right? I don't know what that is. I was asking, what's the case of treifa? The Gemara says, listen to this. What's the case of treifa? If you could tell which animal is the treifa, then what? Then go and remove it from the group. And if you don't know, in other words, if you're not sure if it's a treifa or not, in other words, so here's the interesting part about a treifa. A treifa could be an animal also with an internal condition that you really wouldn't know about until after shechita. So what essentially the Gemara is saying is, if it's a discernible condition, then just remove it from the flock. If it's not discernible, then how do you know that it's a treifa to begin with? To which the Gemara says, it's very interesting. I'm asking, what's the case over here? So listen to this. You had two animals. One animal was pierced by a thorn, and the other animal was bitten by a wolf. So apparently, Rashi points out over here that when an animal would get bitten by a wolf, ultimately the animal would die of a wolf bite. It was poisonous. I don't know, maybe some type of wolf, maybe the wolf was rabid, whatever the case. The interesting part is the injury inflicted by a thorn, and apparently, again, the injury of a wolf bite, I guess, looks similar. The Gemara is presupposing they look similar. So what ends up happening is I know that I have an animal that was pierced by a thorn or bitten by a wolf, and these animals are mixed into the group. So therefore I can't tell which is which. That's the first approach. And therefore, again, Obviously, animal bitten by a wolf, that's a treifa. Rish Lakish says, Kagon, the Arev bin a fula. Interestingly enough, there was an animal that fell off, let's say a height, fell off a raised area. And I will say that animal got mixed in. So externally, that animal looks the same. The Gemara says, Nami, but 1 second. And therefore, the concern over here is that the animal that fell down from an elevation is a treifa. Nefula nami, but even if the animal fell down, libdika, you could check it. In other words, I will say there is ultimately, again, a bedika. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, what's the bedika for an animal that fell off? In other words, how do you know if an animal fell off an elevated area? If it's a treifa or not? So actually, Chazal say if it can walk. If the animal could walk, that's a good indication it's not a treifa. If it can't walk, that's a good indication it is a treifa. So in other words, if you're concerned, just check the animal. Kasavar amda tzricha me'esleis, halcha tzricha bedika. Because this particular Tana holds that ultimately, again, even if the animal is able to walk, the only way to know that it's not a treifa is if it lives for another 24 hours. Ultimately, again, and if it walked, ultimately, again, still you would require an internal examination. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Kigon di'are bivlad treifa. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what's the case over here? The case over here of treifa is where it's the offspring of a treifa that got mixed into the sacrificial group. And Rabbi Yirmiyah happens to hold that the offspring of a treifa is ultimately, again, unfit for sacrificial use. Now here's what's interesting. Now the offspring of a treifa, fascinatingly enough, could be totally and wholly healthy on its own. Its disqualification is that it's the offspring of a treifa. So I will say, point over here is, these are all three different opinions as to what the case of the treifa is in the Mishnah. And is no matter which opinion you hold, like halacha l'maisa, you can't distinguish the treifa from the rest of the chevra. Hence, the Mishnah says you have to allow the whole sacrificial group to graze until they develop mumin and then sell them off. Now the Gemara just says, Rabbi Lazar, Vlad the treifa lo yukra b'gam mizbeach. As we just said, Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that the offspring of a treifa cannot be used for sacrificial purposes. Now the Gemara says, Kulu krabiyanai lo amri, because now the Gemara is going to discuss why each opinion does not agree with the other. So the other two opinions don't hold like Rabbi Yanai. Why? So they say, the Gemara says, people can't tell the difference between a wolf bite and a hole made or a puncture made by a thorn. Why? So apparently, again, a wolf's bite is elongated versus a thorn puncture is circular. Okay, Kreish Lakish Lo Amri. They don't hold like Kreish Lakish. Why? Kasavri Amda Ina Tzricha B'dika Me'es Leis. Because they hold if an animal fell off an elevation but then is able to stand, it does not require any further examination. Holcha, furthermore, if the animal actually walked, it does not require internal examination after its slaughter. And ultimately, again, they don't hold like Rabbi Yirmiyah. Why? The Gemara says, because they don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer, because again, they hold that Vlad Treifa ultimately, again, is going to be permitted. All right, so bottom line on both sides, the opinions, bless you, the opinions don't agree with each other, but bottom line for us is halacha l'maisa. There's three different opinions as to what the case of the treifa is in the Mishnah. Beautiful. Let's go back there. Kachim bekachim min b'mino. So we'll say, so remember again, the last part of the Mishnah, Torah's last part of the Mishnah was very interesting. The last part of the Mishnah is if you have different karbanos mixed in. Let me just read to you from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, kachim bekachim min b'mino. Right? Let's say you have different karbanos that are mixed in with each other. Right? Same type of carbon, all mixed in with each other. So what's the issue in that case? The issue in that case is we don't know who the owner is, right? So let's say Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. This is a good parasha, right? All the Chebra, right? Everybody's born in this week's parasha. Not everybody, but again, up to Yosef. Everybody's born in this week's parasha. So now let's say they all had karbanos. Their karbanos, let's say they all had shlamim, for argument's sake, right? So therefore, all of their karbanos got mixed together. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, what's the halacha? No problem. Just offer it up. Just let the Kohen go ahead and offer them up. And even though we don't know explicitly which animal belongs to which person, it's okay. It's okay. The Kohen will just simply go ahead and have in mind, this is Reuven's carbon, this is Shimon's carbon. Again, even though he doesn't know which animal is which. So the Gemara says, 1 second. But 1 second, you need smicha. Remember again, smicha is the act of leaning on the animal. So again, you can't do smicha but you don't know which is your animal. So how is this being offered up? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef, the karban nashim. You're right. The Mishnah is talking about women's karbanos. So women don't do smicha. Women don't have a din of smicha. Smicha is a din by men. So the Mishnah must be talking about women's karbanos that don't require smicha. So the Gemara says, okay, aval the karban anashim lo. So you tell me then that the Mishnah's halacha would not apply to men. So in other words, if I have a group of men's karbanos that gets mixed in, even though again it's all the same type of karbanos, you're telling me then you couldn't offer it, right? You couldn't offer it since smicha ultimately again is not possible. To which the Gemara says, well, if that's true, top of Ayin Hey, Ayin Hey, good 75a, Esvei Abai raised the kasha, carbon yachid, shenis areid becarbon yachid, the carbon sibur, shenis areid becarbon sibur. So let's say the following case: you have an individual carbon that gets mixed with another individual carbon, or a carbon sibur that gets mixed with another carbon sibur. The carbon yachid, the carbon sibur, shenis arvu zevazat, or for that matter, again, a carbon yachid and a carbon sibur that get mixed together. No sein dalid matanos mikol echad ve'echad. So I will say, so what do? You do 4 blood applications, ultimately again, from each and every carbon. This way, again, you're covering all of the blood applications, all the possibilities. V'imnasan matana echad, v'imnasan mikol echad yatsa. Sorry, v'imnasan matana mikol echad yatsa. And if you did 1 matana from each, ultimately, again, you're yotze as well. V'imnasan arba mikulan yatsa. And if you did 4 from each, ultimately, again, you're yotze as well. So again, we actually saw this before, that when you have carbonos that get mixed together, we're going to see this again on Pei Medalif. When you get carbonos that get mixed together, essentially what you do is you kind of appeal to the highest common denominator, and your yotze. When is this so? This is when the animals will mix together. They got mixed together while they were still alive. But if halacha l'maisa they got mixed together post slaughter, then no sein arba matanos mikulon. You give 4 matanos from all of them. V'imnasan matana achas mikulon yatsa. And ultimately, again, if you did 1 matana from all of them, ultimately you're yotze. Okay, now we'll see why this is being brought down. Rebbe says, Roanes hamatana. Now, we'll say this so far unrelated. You're going to see why this is being brought up, but this happens to be an interesting fact. Rebbe says, Roanes hamatana. We look at the actual amount of blood for the blood application. So we'll say we've actually never seen this before in all of our travels through Zevachim, about when we talk about blood applications, is there a shear, right? Is there an amount of blood that actually has to be applied? So Rebbe is the first person who comes along and says, by the way, when it comes to matanos, now in this case over here, because you're doing a matana, but for potentially multiple karbanos, so Rebbe says you have to make sure that in the blood application, there's enough blood for each of the karbanos. Now we've never seen that before. Again, like I said, so katani, Yochid Dumya Detzibor. Now, both said, interestingly enough, according to this brisa that we just mentioned, we are comparing an individual carbon to a communal carbon. Mat Sibor Gavri, Af Yochid Gavri, just like Sibor, ultimately again is brought on behalf of men. So too again, the Yochid, the carbon Yochid we must be talking about, is also talking about men. Now we'll say, now remember, let's take a step back over here. What was the Mishnah's case? The Mishnah's case was that a bunch of people get their carbonos mixed together. Right now, the good news is, what's the good news? Same type of carbon. Bad news, we don't know whose carbon belongs to who. Mishnah says, no problem. What do? Just offer them all up, and the Kohen will just have in mind that whoever's carbon belongs to whoever should ultimately, again, should work that way. And then in other words, that everybody's carbon should go ahead and satisfy their obligation. The Gemara says, 1 second. What about smicha? What was the answer to that? Women's karbanos. That is din of mixed karbanos, right? Mixed up karbanos is only a din by women's karbanos that don't require smicha. But by inference, if it would be men's karbanos, then this mechanism, this advice would not work. On both sides, the Gemara then quotes the brisa. The brisa is talking about a case of mixed karbanos, and it's telling you that what? You could offer them up. Now it says carbon sibur, carbon yachid. Now the Gemara says just like a carbon sibur is a men's carbon, because it will say, interestingly enough, the way the Gemara understands karbanos sibur, like for example, karbanos sibur are generally, whenever you have a communal carbon, that is generally the criteria is based on the male population. So just like a carbon sibor ultimately is a men's carbon, so too carbon yachid is talking about a men's carbon. And what do you see from here? That in the case of mixed up carbonos, you can offer it up, obviously without smicha. That contradicts what we said before. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, B'tizbara, Hamitaretztehi. Rava says, hold up. You're presupposing that the version of the Brisa that you're reading right now is correct. How do you know it's correct? So the Gemara says, Diktani b'medam, when is this so? B'shkishenis arvu chayin. Remember again, we spoke about this idea. The Brisa just said before, when is this so? When the karbanos were mixed up while they were alive. Aval this arvu shchutin, but if they were mixed up once they were slaughtered, lo. And then this doesn't work. But now it comes along Rava, and Rava says, I don't understand. Mali chayim, mali shchutin. What are you talking about? What does it matter if the karbanos were alive or they were slaughtered already? The same halacha should apply. This is what it means to say. When is this so? Shiris arvu shchutin ke'ein chayim bikosos. Ultimately, again, when is this so? When is this halacha so? That in other words, that you could do these blood applications that work for everything. That's ultimately, again, when they are mixed together, even if they're slaughtered, but like they're alive. What's the case? Bikosos. Ultimately, again, where you have the blood of each of these karbanos in individual receptacles. Aval bebolel, but ultimately, again, if it's mixed together, no sin dalid matanos lekulan. You do 4 blood applications for all of the collective karbanos. Vimnasa matana achos lekulan yasa. And ultimately, again, if you did 1 blood application for all of them, then you are yotze. So we'll say, what's the point over here? The point over here is that the Gemara is saying that this is not talking about live animals. That's the point over here. It's not talking about live animals. Rather, it's talking about animals that have already been slaughtered, and the Gemara is talking about the blood got mixed up. In other words, so that's what's over here. In other words, so which means that what? There was smicha. In other words, when the animals were alive, we knew exactly who everything belonged to. They did smicha, they did shchita. Now we're up to this time of zrika, of blood application. And now what ends up happening? Now everything gets mixed up. And there's 2 different cases of either you have individual receptacles of blood or all the blood got mixed together. Either way, the confusion sets in at the time of zrika. That's where this brisa picks up. And the brisa is saying, okay, here's what you do if it's mixed together, if it's individual, here's the blood applications. But this is a case where at the time of shchita, there was ownership clarity. So because there's ownership clarity, whoever needed to do smicha did smicha, and therefore, again, it's not comparable to our case. Incredible. Rabbi says, so we'll say, so now that we resolve that, so therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, this brisa is not a contradiction, ultimately, again, to what Rabbi Yosef said. They are dealing with the case of carbon nashim, women's karbanos, in our Mishnah that don't require smicha. Now the Gemara just seizes upon that statement of Rebbe, because what did Rebbe say? Remember again, Rebbe Omer, Ro'ana samatanim yesh ba kedei lazeh, or kedei lazeh kshera, ve'im lav psula. So remember again, I both say, Rebbe was the one who said that now when you're doing these collective zrikos, so Rebbe said we have to look at the amount of blood that you have. If there's enough of a blood application for this and for this, then ultimately again you're yotze. So the Gemara says, now by the way, how much blood that is not Rebbe like what does that mean? Enough for this and enough for this. How much blood exactly does that mean? So obviously, I'm say that we'll have to get into. So we're me say the Rebbe Haisivara. Does Rebbe really hold this way? Vatanya, but we learned. Amar Rebbe said, the divrei Rabbi Eliezer, we'll say Amar Beis. The divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Hazah kol shehu mitahares. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. So Rebbe said as follows. Rebbe says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Hazah. Now we'll say, we're switching gears. What's Hazah? Hazah is paraduma. Hazah is by paraduma, right? Which means, again, this is talking about someone is tameh. There's only one way to become ritually pure from corpse tumah, and that is to ultimately, again, take the waters of the para aduma and have them sprinkled upon you. So the Gemara says, Hazah kol shehu mitahares. How much water, how much para aduma water do you need to have sprinkled upon you? Ultimately, again, in order to go ahead and become tahar, kol shehu, any amount. Look at Rashi for just a moment. First Rashi on 75b. Hazah koshu mitahares. Chada milsahi. Shazah koshu mitahares. Ulkama mefaresh amai. Fine. So Hazah koshu mitahares. Hazah. So we'll say. So now here's what's interesting. The Gemara is presupposing that whatever is true for Hazah is true for Zrika. That's what the Gemara is presupposing, and therefore halacha l'maisa. If Hazah, the sprinkling of the waters of the para aduma, doesn't have a shear, any amount is going to work. So too halacha l'maisa for Zrika, any amount of blood application is going to work as well. So the Gemara says, which Gemara says no. Hazah ain't a tzricha shear. The Gemara says Hazah mechza kasher umechza pasol. So Hazah kosher mitahares. Why? Because Hazah ain't a tzricha shear. Apparently, again, Hazah, sprinkling of the water, does not require any shear. The Gemara says, Hazah mechza kasher umechza pasol. The Gemara says, if you look at Rashi, Hazah mechza kasher mechza pasol. Kilomar velo tema dazah kosher demitahares demitahares imkein. Im his arbus pasol elafilu im yesh hataroves pasol kshera umechza. Im hataroves pasol kshera mechza lav dafka elaleka shir tu adin lematan damim. To which the Gemara says, "Lidvar Rabbi Lazar Kamar v'bais ema hazal luchod unesina luchod." So I'll say, so the havamina ultimately was that halacha l'maisa, whatever applies to hazal, ultimately the end should apply to Zrika as well. Kamash Malon, Hazah Luchod, and Zrika Luchod. Two different halachas. Zrika may in fact require shear. Now, both say, now, again, like I said, this sugya is actually in a couple of days from now. We're going to get to it on pay. How do we pass it like Rebbe? Is there actual shear for Zrika or not? That remains ultimately, again, to be seen. That needs to be seen. So I'll say, but what comes out clearly is, at least according to Rabbi over here, or at least according to the Gemara right now, there may be a difference between Hazah and Zrika. It's possible that again Hazah has no shear. V'haraya again, even if some of the water that gets mixed in may be invalid water, we'll have to see about that. But Allah Zrika may still require a shear. Incredible. All right, let's go back there. This Arbu Bebecharu Meiser. So now we're coming to the end of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah then spoke about the idea that if you have a sacrificial, regular animal that gets mixed in with Bechar and Meiser. Now again, remember again, Bechar and Meiser are unique. Why? Because they become the property of the Kohen. Remember again, a Bechar animal, Meiser animal, there are sacrificial parts. But Lamaisa ultimately again become the property of the Kohen. So what was the halacha? If you have a regular animal that gets mixed in with these other animals, Yiru Achi Stavu, ultimately again you let them graze until they develop. I'm just reading the Mishnah. Biyochal ki bechar u'meiser. And then again, all of the animals are consumed in accordance with the standards of bechar and meiser. So says the Gemara, Rami Barchama, Bechar lebei Shammai ein ma'achil l'nidas. I'll just mention just in the previous Gemara how beautiful this is. Just something to contemplate that when it comes ultimately again to Zrika, it's possible. Right? The Gemara just made a fundamental distinction between Zrika and Hazah. Zrika representing blood applications on the Mizbeach. Hazah, the sprinkling of the waters, ultimately again of the paradum waters onto someone who's tamei. And the Gemara just made a tremendous, interesting distinction, that it is possible that Zrika needs a shear, but Hazah, any amount, ultimately, again, affects Taras, purifies. And I will say, what a tremendous lesson. That it could be that, when it comes ultimately, again, to one's Avodas Hashem, when it comes to the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there are rules and regulations. There's a shear. This is shear, right? The will say, person goes ahead and says, I'm only going to put on my tefillin shal yad. I'm not going to put on my tefillin shal rosh. Right? I'm going to put tefillin. So again, it's not the best example because there's a mitzvah for that also, right? But Lamais, it doesn't work that way. There's a shear. There's a shear. Person says, I'm going to keep these halachas, not those halachas. Now, by the way, we all do that. I'm going to keep these halachas, not those halachas. But again, at least if I do it, I know I know that it's wrong, and I'm striving for something better. When it comes to avodas Hashem, there's a shear. There's a shear, right? There are rules. There are things you have to do. Yet when it comes to Tara, any little bit has the ability to purify a person. We all struggle with tumah in life. We all struggle with different forms of impurity of thought, impurity of action, impurity just of lifestyle, that we all have that. It's important to know that sometimes it's even the smallest thing that could rectify impurity in life. It's even the smallest drop that has the ability. Sometimes all I need is a little bit of kedusha, a little bit of holiness to rectify the impurities of life. It may only be an episodic rectification, right? It may only be a little bit of a temporary fix. But sometimes all you need is that little bit of, that little splash of paraduma water, right? That little splash of tara. And at least in that moment, everything is as it should be. Tara does not necessarily require ongoing comprehensive change. Sometimes all you need is a little bit of that splash of beautiful para aduma ruchnius, that little splash of inspiration, that little splash of holiness, and at least in that moment, everything is as it should be. The Gemara goes right there. Shabbos says, when it comes to a bachar. Now, both say, remember again, what happens with bachar? What happens with bachar? The bachar animal is, I have a first part of my flock. What do? I give it to the Kohen. Right? Now that belongs to the Kohen. Sacrificial parts offered up on the Mizbeach, and that ultimately again goes to the Kohen. So what's the halacha? Ein ma'achilin lenidos. A nida can't eat bachar meat, right? Because now again, when the Kohen goes ahead and slaughters it, it's his. But even though it's his, I will say, nevertheless, what? It has a heightened level of kedusha. Because of that heightened level of kedusha, a woman who is tmeya, because she is a nida, ultimately can't consume it. Tmura samahu. What if you did tmura? Now, boss, I remember again, what's tmura? You have a sacrificial animal and you exchange it for something else. What's talacha when you do that? Both animals, the original animal and the exchange animal, are kodesh. So boss says, so now the Kohen gets the tmura also. Is a nida allowed to eat from the tmura? Similarly, again, bachar eino nifta. So ultimately, again, a bachar can't be redeemed. Can't redeem a bachar. Tmura samahu. What if, again, I will say, I'm the Yisrael. So now I did a tmura. Can the tmura be redeemed? Bachar eino mishka balitra tmura samahu. So remember again, we had this in the Mishnah. Part of the sanctity of a bachar is that even though it belongs to the Kohen, you can't treat it like regular meat, which means you can't shecht it in a slaughterhouse, right? And you can't weigh it on a scale. Right? That's the way like regular meat, that's like transactional meat. You can't do that with bachar meat. What about the temura of a bachar? Can you go ahead and shecht it in a slaughterhouse, and can you weigh it with a scale? Samar Rava said, Tanya, bachar umaiser mishahumu osen temura utmurasan kiyotse bahan. So listen to this. The Brisa said, bachar animal and meiser animal, when they develop a mum, ultimately, again, you can go ahead and make a tmura, and the tmura ultimately has the sanctity of the original animal. So, asked the following shayla: Hitvis bachar. So, we'll say, so again, what that sounds like ultimately is that aloch lemaisa, the tmura of a bachar has the same status as a bachar. So, whatever applies to bachar applies to tmura. So, therefore, again, just like a nida can't eat bachar, a nida can't eat temura. Just like ultimately, again, you can't go ahead and shecht the bachar in the slaughterhouse or weigh it on the scale, so to the temura, it can't be shechted in the slaughterhouse or weighed on the scale. Okay, incredible. So, the next case. Hitvis bachar bedak habayis mahu sheyishko b'litra. So, most of this is very interesting. Let's say a Kohen has a bachar animal. Or I have a bachar animal, right? And what happens? It develops a mum. The person, obviously, at that point, when a bachar animal develops a mum, it loses some elements of its bachar sanctity. At that point, and Abba says, what do? I pledge that animal to Bedek Habayis. To Bedek Habayis, right? To temple upkeep, which means financial sanctity. So now what's the shaila? Can I measure it on a scale? And Abba said, now what's the chap over here? Now, I'm going to end up selling off this meat. Now, it's in the interest of the Beis HaMikdash that I measured on a scale. Why? Because it's more exact. The more exact the measurements are, the more money I can make. Who's making the money? The Beis HaMikdash. So the shaila is normally, we would say, that you cannot go ahead and use a scale for the meat of a bachar animal, right? That's what we just established, because that's a lack of sanctity or lack of respect towards the meat. What about here, where the use of the scale is actually for the benefit of the Beis HaMikdash? Is that permitted? So the Gemara says, Ravcha the hekdish adif. Do we say that again? Profit to the Beis Hamikdash is more important. O dilma zilusa de bechar adif. Or do we say no? That's a degradation to the sanctity of bechar. So we'll say we have competing values over here. Which one do we choose? I'm Rabbi Yossi bar Zvida. Tashma. Let's analyze this. Nisarvu bebechar b'maiser. So you're going to say quotes our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is you have a regular animal that gets mixed in with bechar and maiser animals. So what's the halacha? What do you do? What do you do with the chevra? Yiru achi stavu. You let them graze until they develop a mum. V'yochlu ki bechar uki maiser. And ultimately, again, then you consume all of the animals. You could consume them, but you have to do so in accordance with the strictures of maiser and bechar. To which the Gemara says, doesn't that mean lav l'meimra te'eno nishka b'litra? That obviously means that halach l'maisa, you can't weigh it. You can't weigh it with the normal weight. So what do you see from here? That ultimately, again, even once the bechar animal develops a mum, halacha l'maisa, it still retains elements of its bechar sanctity. Most notably, you can't weigh it on a scale. How can you compare it? So in the case of the Mishnah, shtei kedushos ushnei gufin. Remember again, in the case of the Mishnah, they both say you have 2 kedushos and 2 gufin. Now, what does that mean? Remember again, in the case of the Mishnah, you have different animals and different kedushos. In our case, our case, which is the case of the bechar that becomes blemished, that you went ahead and you gave to the Beis Hamikdash bedek habayis. Ultimately, again, it is shtei kedushos v'guf echad. In our case over here, it's 2 kedushos but 1 body, right? Because it's 1 animal. What are the 2 kedushos? On one hand, bechar. On the other hand, bedek habayis. So the cases really are incomparable. Maskef Rabbi Yossi bar Avin ma ilu amar heftu li bechar. So Rabbi Yossi bar Avin said like this. Imagine if a person were to say like this. So we'll say, I have the bechar. Let's go with this case. I have the bechar animal. It developed a mum. I went ahead and I gave it over to bedek habayis. Now, boss, imagine I came forward and I said the following. I said, Hiftu li bechar shetfis lo bedek habayis. I'd like to redeem the bechar that I pledged to bedek habayis. The Gemara says, Klun shomim lo. Ultimately, again, would we listen to him? So of course not, because you can't redeem bechar. You can't redeem it. To which the Gemara says, Rachmana Omar Heftu Lo Sipta. The Torah says you can't redeem it. So both sides. So again, the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rabbi Ami Klum Hiknezeh Ela Masha Kanolo. So both sides. So essentially, Rabbi Ami says, in general, when you convey something, you could only convey that which you have. In other words, a conveyance, the person who receives a conveyance has no more rights than the conveyor himself. That's the way conveyances work. Say for Rabbi the Gemara says, look at Rashi just a moment. It's the third of the intermediate wide lines. Fourth, sorry. Klum hekneh hakoin zeh lebedek habayis ela mashe kana lo begufo bebechar zeh v'cheven de etzlo lo hotel lishka v'litra. And Yachala Haknos the Bedek Habayis Odef Tamid Tzimtzum Mishkal Litra. Suppose remember again, what was our case? Our case was that the Kohen has a blemished bachar that he wants to give to the Beis Hamikdash for Bedek Habayis temple upkeep. Now again, remember, when the Kohen had the bachar, there are certain strictures in the consumption of that meat. Namely, you can't weigh it on a scale. The shaila now is when he gives it over to Bedek Habayis, can he have the meat weighed on a scale? Why would you want that? That's the benefit to the Beis Hamikdash. Definitely beneficial to the Beis Hamikdash, ultimately, again, to have the meat weighed. So now the Gemara says, halacha l'maisa over here, halacha l'maisa. So now, bottom line, let me just get to the conclusion. What's the halacha? The halacha is it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because the Kohen's conveyance to the Beis Hamikdash can be no greater than his actual rights. And since when the bechar was his, he wasn't allowed to weigh it. Therefore, again, even though now he's giving it to the Beis Hamikdash, and it's to the benefit of the Beis Hamikdash to weigh it on a scale, ultimately, again, they can't. So even halacha l'maisa, once that bechar has been given over to the Beis Hamikdash, they cannot weigh it on a scale because the received bechar can be no stronger than, or I should say, the conveyance ultimately only conveys the rights of the actual Kohen himself, no more, no less. Incredible. Both said, let's finish up. Hakol yucholin lehis aref. So both says, remember again, the Mishnah then said, end of the Mishnah, anything can get mixed together. In other words, the Mishnah says, all of these cases of mixtures are possible, with one exception. Chutz min achatas va'asham. Achatas and an asham can't get mixed together in a mixture of sacrificial animals. So says the Gemara, why not? So why can't the chatas and an asham get mixed together? Well, the Gemara would say on a simple level, the high zachar, the high nekeva. Because ultimately, again, an asham is a male animal, and a nekeva is a chatas. So again, I will say, can't really have a mixture of male and female, no matter how they identify, right? Because lemaisa, again, anatomically, they're going to be distinct. So because they are distinct, therefore, halacha lemaisa, again, there's no mixture. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, chatas va'olanami. But then you can make the same argument to the chatas and an ola. Why? Because the chatas ultimately is always a female animal, and an ola is a zachar. So again, I can make the same argument over here. The Gemara says, no, there is an exception to this. Why? Ika seir nasi. Ultimately, again, say there is the seir of the nasi, right? Which ultimately, again, is a chatas offering, but halacha l'maisa is a zachar. So the Gemara says, Hai seir v'hai tzemer. Sorry, Hai seir v'hai tzemer. But I will say there is a difference ultimately, again, between a goat and a sheep. So apparently, again, one has hair and one has wool. A goat has seir. Ultimately, again, a sheep has wool. So I guess those who know. I don't know, right? So we'll say, so l'mais, again, there will be a distinction between those two as well. I Pesach va'asham nami lo ma'arev. So again, you can make the same argument. A Pesach, carbon Pesach, and an asham also wouldn't be able to get mixed together. Why not? Hai ben shana v'hai ben shtei shanim. They're different ages. A carbon Pesach has to be an animal within 1 year, versus ultimately, again, an asham which is 2 years. To which the Gemara says, Ika asham nazir v'asham etzora. First of all, again, I will say there are other type of asham, like an asham nazir, asham etzora, that ultimately, again, are animals that are within 1 year. The other passage is, Ika ben shana demechse ke ben shtei shanim, v'ika ben shtayim demechse ke ben shana. Here's the difference also. When you have animals of the same type, ultimately, again, but different ages, that's not necessarily a distinguishable thing. Because they will say sometimes you could have an animal that is 1 year old that looks like 2, and sometimes you could have an animal that is 2 years old that looks like 1. They will say a profound Musar Haskell, right? That when it comes to living beings, sometimes you could have something that is young that acts incredibly mature. Sometimes you could have something that is mature that acts incredibly young. And I will say this is important for us because this is a good chizik. Biological age need not be a determinant for our ability to succeed in life. A person could be young and ultimately, again, not have a lot of life experience, but could have the wisdom to attach, like Rabbi Tzadok said, could have the wisdom ultimately, again, to attach himself to people who have more life experience and therefore live the life of someone a little bit more seasoned. On the other hand, sometimes a person could be older, but yet still repeat the same mistakes of youth over and over and over. So much of life, we'd love to say that life is about not making mistakes. That's impossible. Everyone makes mistakes. So what's life about? Life is about not making the same mistakes over and over and over. The goal in life is don't be a 2-year-old who looks like a 1-year-old, right? Don't go or behaves like a 1-year-old. Don't be someone who is mature. Don't be someone who is biologically advanced, who is still making the same exact mistakes as he did when he was young. To make no mistakes is impossible, but at least to learn from our mistakes, to try to do better, to try to do different. We'll end up making different mistakes, but at least if we're not repeating the same ones, right? As long as I'm not a 2-year-old acting like a 1-year-old, then ultimately, again, that is a life well lived, a life well led. By the way, great run today. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, we caught up with the rest of Klal Yisrael by Shabbos. Shkoyach, good Shabbos, everyone. Chevron Zoom, have a great Shabbos. Yeah.
Rashi says that it's a nail. It's a scratch.